Hello, welcome to the channel. Today at Philosopher we'll be talking about the matrix. So the matrix suggests that we might be living in an illusion. Philosophically speaking, how can we be certain that what we see is real?
It's interesting you ask that question and say philosophically speaking, because The Matrix is a pretty philosophical film. And that question is one posed by a very famous philosopher, René Descartes, French philosopher writing in the 17th century, who's associated with the origin of modern philosophy, skepticism, and the birth of science. The question he's trying to pose is pretty much exactly the same as the one you've cited there. And it is the one that The Matrix seems to explore as a kind of thought experiment. Descartes' purpose is a bit different because his purpose is to establish certainty of what can we be certain. Let's produce or disclose or establish the ground for all truth, certainty, knowledge, and progress from there. But he comes at it almost as if he's watched The Matrix and is then posing this question by starting not with what's real and what is, but by doubting everything. Let's assume that all that there is around us is illusion and is wrong, and there is nothing of which we can be certain. And it's that inquiry that leads with his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am, je pense, donc je suis." And he arrives at that by saying, well, if I can doubt everything around me, including the things in this room, the world, the reality, even myself, if I can doubt, I'm still thinking, because doubting is a form of thinking. In other words, if I can think everything is an illusion, then my thinking implies that I am existing, because only something that exists can think and even doubt that it's thinking, which is how he arrives at this conclusion. I think, therefore I am. If I'm thinking, I am at least existing. It may all be an illusion around me, but I do exist. Insofar as the matrix is concerned, it may be that that the very nature of reality is illusory, but the question of the existence of the people within it can't really be doubted, because even if they begin to doubt reality, as the main character played by Keanu Reeves does, there isn't really the question of whether he exists or not. It's just a question of the authenticity of the reality in which he's stationed, and which, of course, he is encouraged and led to doubt and to tear apart and step out of in some way.
So Neo finds out that the world he's living in is the matrix, and it's not the real world. But does it matter?
Well, it would matter. So if we take another philosopher, Plato, and I'll also talk about Immanuel Kant. For Plato, it really does matter, because if we are living in an illusory world, we are further from the truth. Plato has this notion of the forms as the ideal, unvarnished world of reality which doesn't exist on the earth. He has this famous metaphor of the cave in a book called The Republic, where essentially he says life here, rather like the life in the Matrix, is just a shadowy copy of reality. It's a fallen, debased or adulterated version of reality. And that means that we are deprived of truth, and we live under illusion, and we're vulnerable to being, well, actually manipulated, Plato sort of implies, as a result of that, because we don't have access to this higher truth. So it does matter. And of course, in the Matrix, that slightly more political or ideological point is made, that those people who are subject to the Matrix are essentially subject to a power that's beyond their grasp, and are therefore being manipulated one way or another. The other, much more modern philosopher, I suppose one could cite in that regard, is Michel Foucault, who talks about the ways in which most societies rely upon what Foucault, and he's influenced by Louis Althusser and Marx and so on, refers to as docile subjects. So those in power need those not in power to be docile, passive, so that they can comply with the interests of those in power without even know they're complying with the interests of those in power. For Marx, that would have been the working class, who haven't woken up from their slumbers, or what Kant calls dogmatic slumbers, and are just serving the interests of those of a more superior economic class without knowing it, which is sort of what's going on in the Matrix. So there is that Foucauldian, somewhat sort of late Marxist view. So yeah, it matters if we are living in a world of so-called reality, which in fact is just a working system for those in power to manipulate those who are not in power. And the film itself, from a film history point of view, seems a little bit influenced, for example, by Metropolis, where, you know, the ordinary people are serving the interests of those in power, those of the Matrix. In brackets, I should say, it's quite interesting, it's called the Matrix. That word, which is semi-Latin, refers to the mother, the mater, the martyr. And yet it seems quite a paternalistic world. So it's actually, the Matrix is more like a patrix than a matrix.
Yeah.
I just put that in brackets. So yeah, it does kind of matter.
So you touched upon Plato's cave, and he argues that most people live in ignorance of reality. Do you think this idea still applies to our modern digital age?
Well, there's another take on that idea that reality is beyond our grasp. And you can argue that our digital world is not real in quite the same way that we might have immediate sensory or physical experience, because things are mediated through screens and machines and software and algorithms and so on. But the other way of thinking about it, I think, is slightly less pessimistic, and that's through this German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's also very interested in the question of reality. And his take is slightly different. He says, so Plato says there is a higher reality, which in fact we are capable of accessing through reason and philosophy and the application of our minds to those higher truths. In the Matrix, we can access the higher reality, but only if we are guided, as Neo is, through it to this place of power. And it's as much a place of power as it is of reality. In Kant says, well, none of us can ever really know reality as such. He has this phrase in German, das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. He says we can never know the thing in itself. The reason being we have minds, and our minds are mediators. So our minds use perception and judgment and language and all sorts of things in order to perceive and make sense of reality. So, you know, I'm talking to you and I think you're real, but actually my experience of you is mediated by how I sense you, how I think about you, the language you use, and so on. So everything is mediated in my mind in some way, in my perception, intuition, and so on. Now, for Kant, that means I can never really know the real you, the real Miri in itself, in herself. But actually, all those processes of mediation, like perception and intuition and judgment and so on, help me make sense of you anyway. So we can make sense of the world even if we can never know it. So it's an interesting distinction that Kant makes there. And one of my favorite phases in Kantian thinking is when he talks about metaphors, because he says that metaphors provide no knowledge, but they help us to think. So I can think about you, Miri, I can think about the room we're in, and I can understand it, but I can never know it. And there's a distinction there between understanding and knowing. Now, if you apply that to the Matrix, you could say that most of the people who are subject to the Matrix don't know the reality beyond the Matrix, and to that extent they are just fools and victims and to be exploited. But they make that reality work for them, so it has a local sense that is available to them and is coherent in its own terms. So they live their lives. Now, they don't know their lives are manipulated necessarily, and you could argue that ignorance in their case is bliss, because they don't know what they don't know. They're unenlightened. They're unconsciously unenlightened rather than consciously unenlightened. And Neo goes from being unconsciously unenlightened to consciously unenlightened to consciously enlightened. Effectively, that's the process he goes through. And Kant says, well, look, we're never going to actually get to the state of conscious enlightenment, but we can have this working understanding, which is somewhere between the objective and the subjective, which is a good enough reality. That's not his phrase, good enough reality. That's a phrase from psychoanalysis. But nevertheless, we make it work. We have understanding, even if we don't have knowledge.
If reality is controlled by external forces, like in the Matrix and through other social constructs, can we ever make truly free choices?
Yeah. And it is a question raised, I think, by the Matrix, the degree of agency available to us. It's not a film really about free will in relation to God, which traditionally the question of free will is raised in relation to, although you could argue the forces who are in power and control the Matrix are gods, small g, plural. They have that kind of power. But again, I think in the world of the Matrix, the unenlightened world of the Matrix, the non-Neo characters, they will have local agency in the sense they will make decisions for themselves within the terms of the Matrix without understanding that it is a controlled environment, and ultimately there is no absolute freedom. So they'll make local choices to get up or go to work or make dinner and so on, but they won't have that ability to make the larger choice. Now, although the Matrix seems to present itself more as a epistemological film, in the sense that it seems to be about the theory of knowledge, what can we know, reality, or indeed metaphysics, what is real beyond the physical, there is a more existential question running beneath it, which is the one you've raised about what freedom to act really is. And I mention existentialism because freedom is such a key word in existentialism. I'm thinking particularly of Jean-Paul Sartre, who, writing a little bit in the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche, says that we become ourselves through free acts, because the world itself is random, it's chancy, it didn't have to be like it was, and there's no apparent meaning to it. There is no God, actually, capital G, singular. And therefore it's up to us to determine ourselves in this radically contingent space. It's an interesting question whether Neo is acting by free will, because he seems to be more or less invited out of the Matrix and given a special ticket, as it were. That seems to me not necessarily an act of choice or agency on his part, at least not completely. But then, of course, he more or less embraces it.
Well, he's given a choice.
He is actually given a choice, although the choice is a binary choice, isn't it? It's a red or blue pill, effectively. Which in the world of existentialism would be too narrow a choice to count as really meaningful, because in existential philosophy, your choice is more absolute than that. And it's, how to live. What are you going to do with your life? And that is almost unconstrained in its possibilities. And one of the first steps in that is actually to realize the degree to which even the way you begin to think about your choices is already preconditioned by the Matrix, quote unquote. So the choices you would have aren't even your choices. It takes quite a lot of conceptual and existential work even to get to the point where you realize there is an almost unlimited freedom to what you can do. that's what Sartre kind of means by the free act, the act gratuit. And for him, that's best manifested, or at least manifested in his own case, through political action and actions of resistance. So he joined the Communist Party, resisted the state in all sorts of ways, and was not an anarchist, but not a million miles away from being an anarchist either in some ways. So yeah, there are questions of free will in the matrix, but the choice he is given between the red and the blue pill, for example, is still a choice he is given, and it's a choice of two. It's a binary choice.
Yeah.
So the degree to which that agency is unfettered, I think, is questionable. It's a limited choice.
Thank you for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and the notification bell.